I'm Megan Lazovick, Vice President from Edison Research. And more importantly, for this study at least, I'm a mom of 2 podcast listeners, age 11 and 8.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Patterson. I am the CEO of Tumble Media and co-host and writer of Tumble, a science podcast for kids. I'm also a co-founder of Kids Listen, a nonprofit advocating for high-quality children's podcasts. And I'm also the mom of 2 podcast listeners, ages 9 and 4.
And hi, I'm Sanden Totten, also a co-founder of Kids Listen. I've led several research studies over there, which have done some great look into this field, but I'm really excited today for this research. I also created podcast Brains On, Smash Invest forever ago for APM, and I am the father of a 2-year-old who doesn't listen to podcasts yet, but if I have my way, he's going to be a super user in no time flat.
Good enough, for sure. Over the past few years, Edison Research has conducted podcast measurement in many categories, but we owe a huge thanks to Lindsay and Sanden and those at Kids Listen for convincing us to pay closer attention to the kids space. Thank you for your partnership and for your guidance in this research.
Yeah, we're very excited that this is happening. So excited. When I first started making podcasts, it was like over 10 years ago, back in the dark ages of podcasting. And we started making a kids podcast. We just thought for fun. We had no idea, is there an audience out there? Would they listen to it? Do they even know what podcasts are? And then something big happened. A little podcast called Serial went and blew up the industry. Soon podcasts had all these ears, all this attention. And it turns out families were listening to podcasts and they found kids podcasts and listened in some really unique, surprising ways. And we're going to tell you more about that in a bit, but this research will get into all that, and it's really exciting stuff.
And of course, an even bigger thank you is owed to our sponsors. These are amazing companies who are producing such great content for kids, and they agreed to fund this research. So thank you to American Public Media, Disney Podcasts, Tumble Media, and Wondery. These companies coming together to fund a study like this is evidence in itself that kids podcasts deserve attention from the industry as a whole.
Yeah, and it has been a real dream come true for us in the kids podcast industry. We started the first research on children's podcast listening habits with Kids Listen back in 2016. And we just finished our 3rd survey a couple of months ago and put that out. But what we found early on was that kids are deeply engaged listeners. They listen to podcasts over and over again, and they love podcasts. But the thing that we couldn't find out without partnering with Edison Research is the true power and potential for podcasts in the kids podcast industry. So we're so excited to be presenting this data, finally.
Us too, thank you so much. And thank you everyone who's joined us today. We encourage you to share what you've learned today. After this webinar, the full report will be available to download on edisonresearch.com. So also feel free to ask any questions throughout this presentation using the Q&A box. We have people standing by to help and answer your questions. Or if you're watching the replay of this webinar, you can email info@edisonresearch.com with your questions. Part of the reason you haven't seen much research in this space is because it is hard to do. In order to get a good sense of the reach of podcasts among kids in the US, we conducted a 3-part study. First, Edison Research conducted a large national survey of parents. This allowed us to ask all parents about media consumption and identify those with kids who were podcast listeners. That helped us with sizing the kids podcast market in the US. It also allowed us to follow up and ask the questions specifically about the benefits of podcasts.
One of the most exciting things about this survey is that not only did we talk to parents, but we also invited their children to join them and take a short survey about podcasts. Now, this survey was really short and simple, so a 6 to 12-year-old would be happy to complete it. Kids love surveys, as we all know. And it's really exciting because we got data of kids and parents talking together. And this is something that's really unique and that we've never seen before in the industry. So that yielded obviously some really great insights into how families use podcasts.
These survey efforts allow us to share feedback from several groups today. We'll have findings from a representative study of parents of kids ages 6 through 12 in the US, findings from parents of podcast listeners, findings from parents of kids in that age group who do not listen to podcasts, and from kids' podcast listeners themselves.
And finally, we met some families in person. We went into the homes of 6 families with young podcast listeners to talk about how podcasts play a part in their lives. And that feels like the best place to start. Let's introduce you to some of those families now.
So I'm going to ask, what is your first name only and where do you live? Remember, first name only.
My name's Evelyn and I have no idea where we live.
Yes, you do.
Now we want to talk about media and
Whatever that is.
So what type of media do you guys consume?
What's a media?
I definitely watch a lot of YouTube.
We watch YouTube a lot.
I watch YouTube videos, movies, TV shows on like different stuff like Netflix, Disney Plus. I listen to a lot of podcasts on Audible.
On the ride to school, we would usually listen to podcasts. I sometimes listen to podcasts. I usually do it if we're in the car.
What's audio? Like radio?
Like something you listen to.
Oh, we listen to podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
what would a car ride be like if you didn't have podcasts?
I would probably threaten to burn stuff down.
We'll hear more from those families today, but you can tell from that video alone that there is an appreciation of podcasts in their home. And that's true in many more homes across the US. We'll cover that and more in the webinar today. And here's an overview of what we'll discuss.
First, podcasts already have a strong reach among kids in the US, and this is the data point I am most excited about. We're going to start with listening estimates among this group, which is bigger than you might think.
We'll also see that kids are engaged listeners. Just like we've seen in adult research, once someone becomes a podcast listener, they tend to listen to podcasts a lot.
And we learned that podcasts foster family connections. And this is maybe the sweetest part of this whole research, because we're seeing that both parents and children love kids' podcasts, and they like sharing it together. It becomes a bonding thing for a family, and they use it as a way to connect, as a way to start conversations, and a way to have fun.
And finally, whether you're making podcasts for kids or not, kids are your future listeners. We'll look at how some of the barriers that are keeping non-listeners from enjoying podcasts and discuss what we can do to grow kids listening.
One of the main things we hope you take away from today and share with the industry as a whole is this: podcasts already have a strong reach among kids. You are already doing a great job with the younger generation. In fact, we asked some of the kids in our study to answer a few questions about podcasts, and it's too cute not to share.
I don't know, like a show with no pictures.
A podcast is something you listen to. It can tell you a story, it can like inform you, it also like entertains you.
Can sometimes tell a story, can sometimes just like talk about opinions, things like that.
You learn about stuff you've never known before.
If you don't have anything to do, it's entertainment for you.
A billion.
Man, probably like millions, maybe possibly even billions.
I'd say over a billion.
1,228,000,228. Is that a number?
That's too many, I don't know, like.
That's a fun number.
No clue. Like, no. I have no idea and I cannot guess.
Probably at least 20 years, maybe more, because radio existed, so.
Since electronics have been around?
I'm going to assume like 1800s, late 1800s.
20 years tops, probably a little bit less.
Shoot, I was way off.
150? No, like 50?
50 years?
Yeah, it's like
Really?
40.
Before Daddy was born? Wait, how old are you?
41.
Oh.
Yeah, like 40 years ago.
So the kids who listen to podcasts in our interviews could do a pretty good job of explaining what a podcast is. And they had a good sense that there is a lot of podcast content out there. These kids, of course, are just a small sample of the kids in the US who listen to podcasts. How many of them are out there? Well, here's our first look at the measurement data. Among kids aged 6 to 12 in the US, 63% are aware of podcasts. Among the general US population 12 and older, 83% are familiar with podcasts. So the younger generation is not too far behind in familiarity when you compare them to the older generation. Podcasts are a part of modern culture.
That's right. 46% of kids aged 6 to 12 have ever listened to a podcast, and 29% of kids in that age range have listened to a podcast in the last month. So that means if you walked into a group of kids, maybe almost half would have ever listened to a podcast, and maybe 1 in 3 might be listening to one every month. That's great.
But what's really amazing is this next number. 23% of kids ages 6 through 12 in our study listened to a podcast in the last week. That indicates that listening to podcasts have become a regular habit among almost a quarter of kids this age. That is so incredible. That means that podcasts have really become a way to connect with kids that we can't ignore.
Yeah, and it makes sense that these families who are engaged, they're listening, a lot. We know that once you start listening to a podcast, it fills these voids in your life that might have been hard to fill otherwise. And, maybe it's right before bed, or maybe it's in the car, but these become part of the routine for families. And that's a really important place to play in. And that's why I think, in my opinion, kids' podcasts are really special and have this kind of stickiness in pop culture.
Let's see how podcast listening stacks up against other audio options among this age group. Now, we know from Edison's share of ear study among the 13 plus population, music listening takes up a greater portion of listening time than spoken word audio. So it shouldn't be too surprising to see that services with music listening have the most monthly listeners. Among kids 6 to 12, 72% listen to online audio services such as Amazon Music, Apple Music, Pandora, Spotify, and so on. 66% of them listen to AM/FM radio in the last month.
And here are the numbers for platforms that are just spoken word audio. We've got 33% listening to audiobooks in the last month, followed by 29% listening to podcasts. What's exciting about that to me is that podcasts are neck and neck with audiobooks, which have been around a lot longer. I bet if we look 2 years ago, podcasts would have been lower, and now they're climbing. And if we look 2 years into the future, that number is going to be even higher, in my mind. So I think that what this really says is that podcasting, it's already found a strong foundation, and it's got a lot of room to grow.
And we'll remind you that 29% is just among the total 6 through 12 age population. That means everyone, every 6 to 12-year-old. Among those with parents who are monthly podcast listeners, 42% of kids 6 through 12 have listened to podcasts in the last month. If you have parents who are podcast listeners, their kids are very likely to pick up the habit of podcast listening.
Here's another thing we really want you to know. Kids are engaged listeners. They spend a lot of time listening, and they have a lot to say about it.
Among that group of kid podcast listeners we identified, 25% of them listen to podcasts nearly every day. Podcasts are becoming a daily habit for a quarter of young listeners. And that percentage is actually pretty comparable to older audiences. According to Edison's share of ear, 24% of those age 13 and older listen to podcasts daily.
These are engaged listeners. So what makes them so engaged? Here's a look at the kids survey we conducted with the help of parents. The number one reason kids say they listen to podcasts is because they think they are fun. 59% of the kids in our study said podcasts are fun to listen to.
Over half said that they like that they can listen while doing other things. This came up in our qualitative interviews as well. multitasking is a reason we often hear from adult listeners, but it's coming up big among those aged 6 to 12 as well. Of course, a portion of this group might be multitasking with Legos, dolls, or dinosaurs instead of laundry dishes and dusting for adults.
44% of kids say liking the podcast host is a reason they listen. And 37% like to learn new things, which totally get it. That's me too. Friends, YouTubers, parents, and teachers are also influencing listening and are listed here as a reason why kids listen. It's worth noting the wording for parents and teachers here. It says that 24% of parents or teachers make them listen. Now, what's probably going on there is that maybe the podcast is being played in the classroom, or maybe a parent is just putting it on in the car to get a little bit of harmony while they're on a long road trip. But it shows that some influences have more power than others.
And just as every child is unique, these kids are finding content that works for their unique interests. Here's some favorites mentioned in our home interviews.
There's a true crime podcast that I like to listen to called Crime Junkie. I'd say the podcasters, Ashley Flowers and Brittany, they're two people that make it. They're really talented, and I just like their voices and how they explain stories.
Probably the Minecraft fan show podcast. Well, it's basically one adult and some kids are like talking about certain topics that relate to Minecraft, like building houses, surviving the night, stuff like that.
I think he gets a lot out of it because it's demographically geared to his age. Like, there aren't many shows where they're like made by people young that are for young people. It's usually old people making stuff for young people. So I feel like he connects better.
Greek mythology.
Do you remember the name of it?
No.
Greeking Out.
No.
Yes, that's what it's called. It's called Greeking Out. I thought it was interesting, right? I thought I liked that for him, it was to his age. They spoke to children, and obviously it kept his attention, which was nice.
We only really listened to two, one about some of the friars we know, and Catholic Sprouts. It teaches us about our faith and different saints and miracles that have happened.
I like to learn about the lives of different saints and what they did. I like to learn about how they went through their life and how different it is today than back then.
Called Smash Bing Best. It's a debate one, where two people debate over two things. Right now we're listening to Halloween versus trick-or-treating. I'm talking birthday parties versus trick-or-treating, and so far Daddy and me both think that trick-or-treating is going to win, but I don't know.
Of course, those 6 families don't represent an entire population of podcast listeners. Here's what kids are listening to according to the survey.
The topic that kids' monthly podcast listeners choose to listen to the most is games, which totally makes sense. Kids love video games. There's a lot of content out there, so they find it in podcasts too. This is an extremely popular topic. This is the Roblox Minecraft generation. Half of them, they want to hear about this world of gaming that they're already inhabiting in other mediums. Then there's interest in music. That's about 43%. And comedy and short stories tie at 39%.
We also had a tie between adventure and bedtime stories at 36%. Science, sports, and history were all favorites among some of the in-person interview subjects we met with. And we even met one family who spoke about the genre that appears at the bottom of the list. 15% of kids say they listen to religion podcasts.
And how does this listening fit into their days? We have some data to share on where and how they listen, but first, let's ask the kids themselves.
I decide I want to listen to a podcast when I'm bored, Pokemon, Minecraft, Mario Maker, getting kind of boring, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to listen to my favorite podcast.
Usually when I'm doing something that I don't want to be doing, like doing chores, cleaning my room, taking walks. It's all stuff that it would kind of be boring just doing it by yourself. If I'm listening to something, it makes the experience go a lot faster and feel a lot better.
In the car, we do use it as more of a boredom manager.
Yeah, like if we're taking a drive somewhere pretty long, because most of their episodes are like an hour long, and like I look on the GPS, see like we got an hour long. I'm like, Mom, do you just want to listen to music or you want to listen to Crime Junkie? She's like, Crime Junkie.
But usually, when we're just pulling out of the driveway, we ask. That's usually what happens. So like when we first get in the car, when everybody's in the car, like in like the first like 2 seconds, like, can we listen to Geeking Out?
Their interest in it has grown since it's become like a family activity. I know that I think now the association with like, hey, when you're traveling and you're just kind of like sitting in the car or sitting, and we don't have any kind of like visual media we can use, that a podcast is a great option.
I feel like it's easier than at home, because at home we have all these distractions like TV and games and all that. But in the car there's like nothing to do, so it's easier to just listen to it.
We did bedtime stories once, but it didn't really take at home. I think my husband reads to them every night, so listening to it at night, they were like, no, Dad reads. Like, so it's almost like they don't know podcasts other than in the car.
Here's another slide where kids and parents align. Home is where most kids' monthly podcast listeners listen to podcasts. 89% say they listen at home. That's where they spend the most time. And that's true among adults too. There's more listening at home because there are more hours at home. But for kids who don't necessarily have their own devices, home can be where they have access to technology that allows them to listen to podcasts.
There's a lot of listening elsewhere too. The survey showed us that half of kid listeners have listened in other people's homes, more than a third listen while walking around, and just less than that listen on transportation or at school.
And it's not surprising that the other major location for listening is in a vehicle. 68% of kid podcast listeners listen in a car or truck. We heard some of that in our last video, because I think the car is uniquely positioned for podcast listening. A lot of the distractions that are in the home are removed in the car, and you can just listen together as a family.
Car rides for kids and parents can be rough, but can also be a great opportunity for bonding over a shared experience. 73% of parents with kid podcast listeners say that podcasts make family car rides more fun. And I have a distinct memory of driving in the car with my 2 little girls crying. I can't recall why they were crying, but there was nothing I could say to calm them. And then I turned on a kid's podcast and we learned about bees, and they were instantly quiet, and it truly felt like a miracle. I'm positive there are other parents that have felt this relief and extreme gratitude in similar moments, and that many families have similar memories.
Yeah, we hear this a lot from listeners to the Tumble podcast, and I've experienced it myself, especially when I go on long car trips with my family. They always ask if there's a new episode of their favorite podcasts, and so it makes the start of that journey like an exciting moment rather than a moment of tedium. And it just changes the attitude in the car, and we always talk about the podcast after we finish listening.
Amazing. How else do we know kids are engaged listeners? Well, their parents say so. 72% of parents of podcast listeners agree that their kids are excited to listen to podcasts.
And as a podcast creator, I can verify this. They're excited. They love the podcast. We get fan mail all the time. We get art. We get, kids taking pictures of themselves listening and sending it to us. So we know that this is something really important to them and that they're really excited about.
And kids are so engaged, they are learning from podcasts and sharing what they learn. Among our kids survey, 94% agreed that they learn new things from podcasts. There is a lot of great content out there delivering information to kids in ways that make learning easy and fun.
I think we can count Tumble among those content providers. We do educational audio, and we hear from kids and parents that the entire family loves learning from our podcasts. Frequently, they'll share what were their favorite parts of episodes. They'll tell us how it sparked more learning together or maybe playing together. And they'll ask questions that are based on what they learned on the episode. We can tell that they absorb it more and more with each listen.
87% of Kid Monthly podcast listeners said that they have shared something they learned from a podcast with other people. Like Lindsay said, they are absorbing the material, thinking and talking about it.
Yeah, and I mean, this makes sense. I've heard plenty of adults say that podcasts give them cocktail party banter. And for kids, it's playground banter or it's classroom banter. You know, it's did you know factoids that kids love to share, because I think kids really like getting a mastery of their world, understanding things, and podcasts kind of help them do that, whether it's a science podcast, a history, a story podcast, sports, comedy. These give them ideas, and they really need that because it lets them feel like they have some control, something to explain, something to share. It's an important feeling for a kid.
Yeah, and to be able to share that with someone that makes them feel so good, it's probably great for self-confidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that desire to share podcasts, that's the seed of this next takeaway. Podcasts foster family connections.
This is a truly exciting statement. We know that podcast listening creates a virtuous cycle. You listen, you discuss, you learn together as a family. And anyone who has a kid knows that when your kid gets into something, parents end up being very invested in furthering their interests, especially if it's something that they can participate in as a family.
Totally. In fact, there's a lot of co-listening happening in the kids podcast space. 69% of Kid Monthly podcast listeners are listening with other people.
Right, which makes sense because kids spend a lot of time with siblings, with classmates, in carpools, with their parents. But it also represents a really unique chance to make shows that work for multiple age groups and that can spark organic conversations among all these people.
So let's look at the survey data to see who they're listening with. And it's mostly with family. 68% of kid listeners listen with parents, 54% with siblings. There's a good amount of listening with friends and classmates and other family members and even caregivers.
Co-listening is an incredibly valuable and somewhat rare behavior for kids because it means what might look like one single listen on your kid's podcast is very likely at least 2 listeners or more in a family. In a classroom, that translates to an enormous number of listeners.
If you've ever experienced a child repeatedly saying, "Mom, watch me do this," or just a general mom, 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 you might understand that sometimes a child is really just asking for attention. So it makes sense that sitting and listening to something together with your child is appreciated by that child. 94% of kids aged 6 to 12 who listened to a podcast in the last month said that they enjoy listening to podcasts with their family.
And the parents we interviewed not only enjoy co-listening, but they think it's really important. 72% say it's important for kids' podcasts to be able to be enjoyed by the whole family. Just like sitting together for a family movie night or having dinner together, the act of listening together can be a fantastic way to connect.
71% say it's important for kids' podcasts to give parents and kids topics to discuss together. This is a really great point because as a parent, I know there are topics that are sometimes difficult to navigate and talk about. Podcasts can be a great starting point for important conversations.
And parents recognize the value of podcast listening. How do we know? Well, we see it in their actions. 74% of parents of kid listeners say they have followed a kid podcast on social media.
But it doesn't stop there. 67% have purchased merchandise from a kid's podcast. And just beneath that, 62% have paid for a subscription service for kids' podcasts. 59% have donated money to a podcast.
And you might find this surprising that half of parents of kid listeners say they have attended a live or virtual event hosted by a kid's podcast. It is really incredible how many parents have put their time and wallets behind kids' podcasts. And I think that shows how much podcasts mean to these families.
As we mentioned throughout this presentation, 29% of kids aged 6 to 12 are monthly podcast listeners. That is a strong number indeed, but it also means that 71% of kids this age are not listening to podcasts on a regular basis. There are plenty of reasons why the industry should invest in growing this space, but perhaps the most important of them is the fact that kids listening to podcasts at a young age will better secure the future of the podcast industry as a whole. After all, kids who listen to podcasts now are more likely to continue to listen to podcasts in the future.
Right. So what are these barriers keeping kids from listening to podcasts, and how do we smash them? Well, we found 3 major themes in our research: accessibility, discovery, and engagement.
Let's start with the more physical of the 3 barriers, accessibility. This is one that I think about a lot as a parent, because when parents of kids who don't listen to podcasts currently were asked why they don't currently listen, a small but indisputable number of them said their children didn't have the time, knowledge, or access to the medium. So let's take a moment to consider the top one. 9% of parents of kids who don't listen say it's because their kids do not have the time.
Now, this 9% might seem like a small number, but when we asked parents of non-listeners about how to appeal to their kids, 60% said their kids would be interested in podcasts if they easily fit into their daily routines. Let's face it, some kids have jam-packed schedules. It's not always easy to find family time. But if these parents were aware of kid podcasts that were short enough to hear during car rides to soccer practice or relaxing enough to hear before bedtime, perhaps they'd be more likely to squeeze in some listening. Or perhaps parents and kids can get in the habit of swapping some screen time for podcast time.
Now, let's look at another obstacle to kids listening: discovery. Among parents of kids who don't currently listen, small but significant numbers reported not being able to find the right podcast, or in some cases, any podcast for their children. 20% said their kids just haven't found one they enjoy listening to. 16% say they just have difficulty finding podcasts for kids. And 13% said it's hard to find a podcast that the whole family can enjoy together. Now, discovery is a big challenge for podcasts across the board, not just kids ones. So it's no surprise that this shows up in the Kids Corner as well. But we should keep in mind that while we're talking about kids who don't listen, we are not starting with a completely blank slate. Many of the parents of these kids who aren't listening to podcasts are actually podcast listeners themselves, or at least aware of podcasts. We learned that 39% of parents whose kids don't listen to podcasts are actually monthly podcast listeners themselves, the parents. And we've already shown just how important parents are to kids' podcast listening. So perhaps the key to boosting this discovery among kids is to reach the parents who we know are already familiar or engaged with podcasts themselves.
And when we look again at our kid monthly podcast listeners, we have evidence to support this. When we asked parents of kid monthly podcast listeners of all the ways their kids were first introduced to the medium, the vast majority, 80%, said that it was either through them or the other parent. Parents are by far the biggest gateways to podcasts, much more so than social media, YouTube, or school. So to reach the kids, you must first reach the parents. But how important are the parents once you break through that initial wall?
So to do that, let's turn to the current monthly podcast listeners for these answers. The last slide showed how kids were introduced to podcasts, but we also asked parents of the kid monthly podcast listeners all of the way their kids currently discover podcasts. We see on this chart here that while parents by themselves are high on the list, only about a half of kid listeners rely on them to discover new podcasts. But if you include the influence of siblings or other family members, the importance of family overall is obvious. 2/3 or 67% of kid monthly podcast listeners find out about podcasts through a family member. So once again, family is the top source of discovery. But what's interesting here is that unlike the initial introduction into podcasts, social media plays a much more significant role. Yes, family is important, but 63% of parents of kid monthly podcast listeners say their kids are learning about new podcasts through social media and YouTube. There are other sources of discovery on this list as well: friends, school, TV, but none of them have the same reach as family or social media.
I guided them in the sense of, these are the podcasts I have found for you. You can listen to them, and then they determine when to listen. or if they want to. Research, specifically podcasts for kids, appropriate podcasts specifically for children.
How do you research?
Google.
I've been listening to podcasts for years. I've never thought about like podcasts that had younger audiences. And we had some family friends. We were talking about podcasts, and they had mentioned how they listen together, so they gave us some recommendations. And the Smash Boom Best and Greeking Out were two of the recommendations that we got. So we're like, we're in the front of the car. Yeah, I think we were kind of bored. What can we do? We were listening to some musicals and stuff, and they were kind of tired of that.
It also helps with my car sickness that I get.
Yeah.
Well, I first learned about podcasts when I was watching YouTube and Mr. Beast, and then I discovered, he has a podcast on Spotify. So I listened to that, and that kind of roped me into other podcasts. But the Minecraft Fan Show podcast I discovered from a magazine called The Week Junior, where they have this thing where Podcast of the Week, and Minecraft Fan Show was on there.
So far, we've covered access to podcasts and discovery. Now let's talk about an obstacle that seems a little harder to control. Engagement with podcasts, how much they kind of draw you in and make you just want to keep listening, those driveway moments we've all heard about. Now, returning to our list of reasons why kids might not be listening to podcasts, we see some higher numbers. 48%, nearly half of parents whose kids don't listen, say it's because their kids prefer visual media over audio. This finding is probably not surprising to any parent listening today. That's a very popular place for kids to spend their time. Scratch that. To any person listening today, they've probably seen kids do this on an iPad, watching away, having a great time. Well, screens and videos, yes, they're highly addictive. They can be very engaging, especially to young kids. But how can podcasts compete? How do they compete?
Well, according to the parents of non-listeners, podcasts can attract these new young listeners by incorporating the other media that kids like and creating shows based on popular entertainment. 79% of parents of non-listeners said their kids would be interested in podcasts if they were based on their favorite TV shows, and 77% if they were based on favorite movies. Aside from relying on existing IP, 75% of parents say that podcasts could also appeal to kids by teaching them something new and making learning fun, which I say many podcasts already do. So this indicates that there's lots of ways that kids could be brought in as new listeners and reinforces the need for education for parents, just pointing out what's already there and what podcasts are doing. Also echoing the findings on the previous chart is that 69% of parents who say their kids would be more likely to listen to podcasts if they had a video component. There are a lot of actionable ideas on this chart, and just figure out which ones make sense for your particular show.
So far, we've covered access to podcasts and discovery of podcasts. Here's another reason families say they aren't listening. 48% of parents whose kids don't listen say it's because their kids prefer visual media over audio, which is no surprise. There's a lot of great video out there, makes sense. We also heard 42% of parents say their kids prefer other types of media, and 21% say their kids don't have the attention span to listen to podcasts. But remember, these are families who don't listen, and they might not know how far kids' podcasts have come. There's a big opportunity here to educate parents about how engaging podcasts are and how many different styles and listening levels are currently in the market. So we know from earlier in this presentation too, that kids who do listen are engaged. They really love podcasts. They find them entertaining, fun, great for the whole family. So this slide tells me that there's a chance to show families who don't listen how awesome kids' podcasts are, and hopefully bring in these families as new listeners. We just showed some building blocks that could be used to create more attractive and more engaging podcasts. But what genres would non-listeners be interested in? Here are the top 5 genres that non-listeners would be into. If the order looks a little familiar, it's because you've seen these top genres before. That's right. Those who don't listen to podcasts have the same interests as those who do listen to podcasts. So that means games are number 1. This is such a crucial finding for the industry because it means there isn't anything significantly different between kids who do listen to podcasts and those who don't. These two groups, they have similar interests. Kids are kids, and this is what they are into. It's just that parents with kids who listen to podcasts have discovered that podcasts are a great way to engage in these interests, while the parents whose kids don't listen to podcasts are either unaware or maybe skeptical of the medium. This brings us back to encouraging the podcast industry to really inform the parents, especially those who already listen to podcasts. Inform them to check out Podcasts for Kids. It's an engaging, educational, fun way to get some screen-free family time. Plus, if we succeed, we'll be creating a new generation of listeners who will very likely carry a love of podcasts into their teen years and beyond.
We actually saw evidence of this in our Gen Z report. Edison released this with SXM Media just a few weeks ago. Our online study of Gen Z monthly podcast listeners found that those who started listening as children reported spending an average of 3 hours more per week with podcasts compared to those who started listening as teenagers or adults. This means that if you can plant the podcast listening seeds when they are young, then they are more likely to become loyal and habitual listeners as they age.
And what's really exciting is that these listeners might now be our future or current podcast creators. In fact, we hear from kids who were inspired by our podcast to make their own. Check out what kids said when we asked them what they'll do if they could build their own podcast.
My podcast is going to be about video games in general, and well, the host is going to be pretty peppy, cheery.
I would probably do something about animals. I love reptiles and dogs.
Yeah, probably something more educational, but also entertaining.
More battles, more bad guys. I think something combining like fantasy and science. Because like I like fantasy a lot, but then I also like learning facts about science. So like some way to like combine both of those together. Not like science fiction, but like actual science facts.
The science debate thing.
Science debate? Ooh,
So like there are
okay.
two different sides of two different science things they debate.
Debating about whether a fact is true or not. That'd be really funny.
Well, cool thing about science is that, you know,
Whether that Earth is flat or not.
Right. Yeah, kind of presenting evidence and seeing if it can sway you about the truth of something. That could be interesting.
Yeah.
So where it would kind of like break down like basic science concepts and then like present it in like little tidbits. So I'd say probably like 5 to 10 minutes, like almost like a minute physics type of thing. We're explaining some kind of like fundamental piece of science. Yeah.
I would not really like that.
You don't think so?
I would.
No.
My favorite part of asking kids to build their own podcast is that they interpret the question in different ways. Some of them thought about what they'd like to hear, and others imagined themselves as the podcast host, creating a show. How fantastic to hear that podcasting is something a person can imagine doing. And for those who are content being listeners, it's great to hear how easily they could pull out their own interests and imagine it as podcast content. It makes me think that those producing content for kids are really lucky to be doing what they're doing and dreaming up content for kids.
Yeah, it's a real privilege. And that's the beauty of kids podcasting right there. It totally sparks imagination, whether you're picturing the faces of the podcasters as you listen, or imagining the whole world of storytelling that you're hearing, or maybe even deciding to actually make your own podcast, which we know a lot of kids go and do. It's clear that podcasts, they kind of occupy this real special place in kids media. And we're just very excited about what that might be like in the future.
I know I love creating podcasts for kids because they are an amazing audience to create for. They are creative, they are imaginative, and podcasts take that imagination to another level. So there's no limit to what you can do with a kids podcast. And we know that the surface has only been just scratched. So the other thing is that as we learn more about podcasts and children's behavior and families, we know that there is so much potential.
And there's more that we can do. We can make sure that kids' podcasts are appreciated to the level it deserves. So here are talking points we can use to accomplish that.
Okay. Podcasts already have a strong reach among kids in the US. Just under half have ever listened to a podcast, and 29% of kids 6 to 12 in the US listen monthly.
Kids are engaged listeners. They listen a lot. They listen again and again, and they're enthusiastic about their listening, and they love to share what they've learned on podcasts.
Podcasts foster family connections. This is truly the most wholesome research finding to date. Listening to podcasts together is important to parents and kids. It makes for quality family time and can help facilitate conversations.
Right. And finally, kids are your future listeners. There's tremendous potential for growing the kids' podcast audience. To do this, families need help to understand that podcasts can easily fit into their busy lives and that podcasts are indeed engaging. And so much of this research points to the fact that parents are strong influencers when it comes to kids' content. So discovery needs to be as easy for parents as it is for kids.
We're really grateful for the support from American Public Media, Disney Podcasts, Tumble Media, and Wondery, and for the partnership with Kids Listen in developing the study. Thank you so much, Sanden and Lindsay, for working with me. It's been such a pleasure. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We'll stick around for a bit to answer any remaining questions in this chat. I know it's a complicated data set with parents and kids and listeners and non-listeners. So if you need any clarification, please drop us a note, or you can email us at info@edisonresearch.com. That's all we got. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Happy listening.